Hello, everyone. My name is Aidan Thomason, and I will be walking through some statistics about voter fraud in the U.S. and around the world. So to start off, I need to give a definition of voter fraud first. We often hear this term in the U.S., especially during election season, but what does it actually mean? Voter fraud is essentially illegal activity that affects individual votes in an election. So this can include impersonation fraud, which is the type we hear most frequently in the news, which would be pretending to be another person and casting a vote in their name. Also, vote buying or selling, duplicate voting, false registration, which just means registering under a fake address or voting somewhere you're no longer registered, or voting when you don't meet the criteria that make you eligible to vote knowingly. It also includes fraudulent use of absentee ballots or intimidation of voters. Basically, it's anything that is done to individual votes or to individual voters to influence their votes. So I want to differentiate this between electoral fraud. Electoral fraud is illegally interfering with the electoral process itself. This would include things like violating campaign finance laws or interfering with poll workers or vote counters. It can also include voter suppression tactics like deregistering mass numbers of voters without informing them, throwing out massive numbers of votes from a certain region, or voter ID laws that target large swaths of people. So a lot of times when you hear the word voter fraud in the news, it's actually referring to electoral fraud or vice versa. So when reading about or listening to reports of fraud, ask yourself in the future, is it affecting individual votes or is it a systematic problem for the integrity of the election? That's essentially how you'll tell the difference. So my presentation is going to focus mostly on voter fraud, as that's the more commonly discussed form of fraud, but the two types of fraud are often linked, right? And sometimes they can kind of co-vary with each other a little bit. So to kind of get into how it looks in the U.S., despite all the talk about voter fraud that we hear in the U.S., actual occurrences of it are extremely rare. The Brennan Center says someone is more likely to be struck by lightning than to impersonate someone else at the polls. So a lot of errors that may initially seem like voter fraud are explained by clerical errors or technical glitches. For example, sometimes when it seems like a dead person voted, it was actually a member of their family who has the same name as them. So like if their son is so-and-so junior, or it could have been a mistake when updating registration polls. So in states where they automatically send you an absentee ballot, they might forget to remove someone who died from the polls and send them a ballot anyways. So there was one example in Connecticut where a ballot was sent to a man who had died and his wife sent the ballot back with a sticky note inside that just said the date he died. But that was counted at first as the instance of voter fraud before they looked at it because she sent the ballot back in his name. So the Washington Post found 31 instances of voter fraud by impersonation from 2000 to 2014 out of over 1 billion ballots that were cast in that time. So they and other sources have also acknowledged that even this number is likely inflated. They took kind of like a liberal definition of what voter fraud was to make sure they were capturing all instances. So the Heritage Foundation, their number for the total number of instances of voter fraud that they've found since 1980. It's more the data is more complete for recent years, like since 2000, but they have some cases dating back as far as 1980. They found 1,302 instances in total in all categories of voter fraud. And by their estimates, there have been 13 cases of impersonation fraud specifically. They're a little bit slanted in their coverage, but I think that 1302 number is probably a good estimate of how many cases of voter fraud have occurred since 1980, and this number extends across all states and all elections that have occurred in the U.S. since then. So every state election, every midterm election, every local election, every national presidential election, it's all included in that number. So from the 2020 election, they've documented 14 cases of fraud, which is hardly enough to change any election outcomes this year specifically. One reason that instances of voter fraud are so small in the U.S. is because in an established democracy that's been running elections for years, these things tend to be lower. So typically the risks of fraud are greater in emerging democracies, but rare in established ones. So historically, the U.S. did have widespread voter fraud in its earlier years, like during the 19th century especially, and a little bit into the early 20th century. These voter fraud campaigns were controlled by institutions like political machines or other entities that could swing large numbers of votes fraudulently. But since their end in the U.S., voter fraud has not really been an issue in the U.S., except these isolated instances. But even more importantly than this distinction between emerging and established democracies, there's very few instances of voter fraud because in the U.S. it's not an efficient way to change an election outcome for an individual. So the number of votes that would be required to quote-unquote rig an election by an individual actor engaging in voter fraud is just really impractical. The margins are so big on these elections that there's really no way that one person could do enough to make a difference. So that's why it doesn't occur a lot. So while voter fraud is not common in the U.S. and other established democracies, it is prevalent around the world, mostly in emerging or restricted democracies. So being classified as partly free or not free by Freedom House or other scholars studying indicators of democracies increases the risk of fraud significantly. So 50% of countries that hold elections are at risk of widespread fraud because of their status in these categories. So vote buying occurs in 40% of all elections, and violence or intimidation of voters occurs about 25% of the time. But the U.S. and other higher-income established democracies don't experience these issues. So they would be included in the 60% and 75% that don't experience these things on a massive scale. So impersonation fraud is still a relatively uncommon form of fraud in any country. So some notable examples of voter fraud around the world would be an example in the Ukraine where people were giving disappearing ink to certain voters so that their ballots would look unmarked after submission and be thrown out. And then in Russian elections, in 2018, they showed nearly 100% turnout in some districts that supported Vladimir Putin at extremely high rates. So you can see that in a graph on the right. So his is the number in green, and while every other number is a part of a bell curve, there's a spike in his towards districts with voter turnout in the 80s and 90s of percentages, which is very unusual and shouldn't be happening under an unobstructed election. So that's a pretty good indicator that there were high numbers of fraudulently cast votes by the state in order to keep Vladimir Putin in power. So I want to illustrate a little bit more about what voter fraud might look like around the world by looking at the case study of Nicaragua. So Nicaragua's elections have faced allegations of widespread voter and electoral fraud in the past, especially in 2008, 2011, and 2016. So in 2016 specifically, there were allegations of enough corruption to change the election outcome when President Daniel Ortega was reelected in a supposed landslide. So he's pictured on the slide. Ortega has a history of human rights violations and corruption during his administrations. So because of that and because of election practices, the country is labeled not free by Freedom House. So I visited Nicaragua in 2016. So some of this information is coming from anecdotal evidence from people that I spoke to while I was there. So residents of the country told me of the widespread corruption in their electoral process, especially in Managua, which is the capital and is a very important electoral district because it's the capital. So one man who spoke to me said that he'd gone to the polls before and been told that he'd already voted by a poll worker when he hadn't, so meaning a vote had been cast for him, presumably by the state. So he said that hundreds of other Nicaraguans experienced the same thing. And a study has estimated that 24% of Nicaraguans were offered gifts or services of some sort in exchange for voting a certain way in the 2008 election. There's also been reports of armed military or policemen barring opposition candidates from entering Managua or other important electoral locations. In 2016, they were excluded from the ballot entirely. So the ballot in 2016 featured Daniel Ortega and his party as the only option on the ticket. So the only option available for citizens to protest his rule was to deliberately ruin their ballots or leave them blank, which 42% of people plan to do in this state. Situations like this reflect a situation that can occur in an authoritarian regime where voter or electoral fraud will be used to gain quote-unquote legitimate power. But in countries with stable elections and peaceful transfer of power, voter fraud is uncommon. The really important thing to point out here is that where fraud is successful, it's being conducted by the state itself, not the voters. So voter fraud committed by individuals is pretty ineffective, but when the state changes votes or intimidates voters on a massive scale or excludes opposition leaders from the ballot or things like that, conducts illegal activity concerning votes or electoral processes, it can and does rig an election. So it seems from the data that I've seen, the only way that voter fraud can really successfully rig an election is if it is done by the person who has access to the electoral process. So essentially the state or the government can only really effectively rig an election via voter fraud, because it being done by individuals is just ineffective. So what are some takeaways from this information? So want to point out voter fraud carried out by individual actors is extremely ineffective and inefficient to change electoral outcomes, which is why it's so uncommon in the U.S. and other countries like it. However, in other countries, the state can use voter fraud as a means to change the electoral outcome since it controls the process. So internationally, voter fraud can happen, can be seen attempted by the state, but seldom by individual citizens in any meaningful way, which is why occurrences of it are so rare. So, and measures that have been aimed at stopping fraud, like voter ID laws in places like the U.S., tend to cause more widespread voter suppression than they stop fraud. So fraud doesn't occur very often. So essentially what this means is just the instances of fraud are so rare that the people that are boxed out by things like voter ID laws or other measures that are meant to prevent fraud actually just end up suppressing more votes legally than they would stop fraudulent votes. So the trade-off is not really equal there. And some people would even go so far as to put laws that have the effect of voter suppression into the electoral fraud category because of that control of the electoral process. So I do want to say that voter fraud can impact elections in a certain sense. While it occurs too rarely to really impact like congressional or federal presidential elections, there have been 2 documented cases in the last 50 years where local elections were impacted by voter fraud. So there was one where the margin was 10 votes and they found 13 fraudulent votes, so that flipped the position of who won, but a court caught that. So, and then there was one other one in Connecticut that was rumored in 2005 to have been affected by voter fraud, but they can't confirm that for sure. So there have been 2 documented cases in modern U.S. elections where voter fraud did change the outcome of the election, but one case was corrected and then the other one hasn't been officially proven, just alleged. So these were local elections, and even among the pool of local elections, it's extremely rare for this to happen, but it is possible in votes with really small margins in very localized areas for voter fraud to play a role. However, on the massive nationwide scale, it's extremely statistically rare. It's really impossible for the rates that we're seeing now to impact the outcome of the election in the U.S. context. So that's really all I had for you guys today. So I have a list of references up here at the end. I hope this presentation has helped you kind of conceptualize what voter fraud is and how and where it occurs in the U.S. and around the world, and kind of think through like what impacts it has, how often it does occur, looking at just the numbers. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation.